I still remember the smell of that laboratory the first time I crossed its threshold. The sharp tang of copper wire and oil mingling with something older, deeper, like the dust of forgotten ambitions settling into the floorboards of a house that had not welcomed a woman in years. It was the autumn of 1888, and I had come to Belgravia with nothing but a worn leather satchel containing my sketches, my tools, and a letter of introduction from Professor Harrington, who had been kind enough not to mention in his correspondence that I was both poor and female, two conditions that made my presence in any respectable laboratory an affront to natural order. Dr. Adrian Blackwood had written back within 3 days, his script precise and unyielding as engraved steel, requesting I present myself at his residence on a Tuesday afternoon. And though I told myself I was prepared for whatever eccentricity awaited me behind those iron gates, I was not prepared for him, nor for what he had built in the shadows of his grief. The house itself stood like a monument to refusal, all dark stone and shuttered windows, set back from the street behind a courtyard choked with overgrown ivy that seemed to cling to the walls as if afraid of being cast out. The butler who admitted me was ancient and silent, his eyes rheumy and incurious, and he led me through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch my passage with collective disapproval. We descended a narrow staircase at the back of the house, the air growing cooler with each step, and when he pushed open the heavy door at the bottom, I found myself standing at the entrance to a world I had only dreamed of in my cramped boarding house room, poring over diagrams by candlelight while the other girls whispered about suitors and wedding lace. The laboratory stretched before me like the nave of some strange cathedral, dedicated not to God, but to human ingenuity, its vaulted ceiling crisscrossed with copper pipes and insulated wires that hummed faintly with electrical current. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with instruments I recognized, and many I did not. Glass beakers and coiled springs and brass gears arranged in patterns that suggested both order and obsession. In the center of the room stood a massive apparatus, a framework of steel and wood draped with canvas sheets, and beside it, bent over a schematic spread across a drafting table, was the man himself. He did not look up when I entered, though I knew he must have heard the door, must have sensed the change in the air as I stood there clutching my satchel and trying not to stare at the sheer scope of his work. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair that fell across his forehead as he worked, and the kind of sharp, angular features that would have been handsome if they had not been set in such fierce concentration. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and there was a smudge of graphite on his left hand that told me he had been drawing for hours, refining some detail that existed only in his mind until he could trap it on paper and make it real. I waited, counting the seconds, feeling the weight of the silence press against my chest. Finally, when I could bear it no longer, I cleared my throat and said, my voice steadier than I felt, that Professor Harrington had sent his regards and hoped Dr. Blackwood had received his letter of introduction. Still, he did not look up, but his hand paused over the paper, the pencil hovering as if suspended by invisible threads. And when he spoke, his voice was low and precise, each word chosen with the same care he must have used when selecting components for his machines. He said he had received the letter, and that Professor Harrington had been uncharacteristically effusive in his praise of my technical abilities, though he had neglected to mention certain particulars that might have been relevant to our arrangement. I felt my face grow warm, knowing what he meant, but I lifted my chin and replied that my gender had never interfered with my understanding of mechanical principles or my ability to solder a clean joint, and if he found my presence unsuitable, I would thank him for his time and return to my search for employment elsewhere. It was a calculated risk, speaking so plainly, but I had learned long ago that men like him, men who lived in their mines and among their instruments, respected directness more than demure apologies. For the first time, he raised his head and looked at me, and I saw that his eyes were a pale gray, the color of winter sky reflected in still water, and that there was something in them that made me think of locked rooms and sealed letters, of things deliberately hidden away. He studied me for a long moment, taking in my plain wool dress and practical boots, the ink stains on my fingers and the way I held myself, neither shrinking nor forward. And then he said that gender was irrelevant to the work, that he required someone with steady hands and a disciplined mind, someone who could follow instructions precisely and keep absolute confidentiality about what occurred in this laboratory. He asked if I understood what confidentiality meant, and I said I did, that whatever he was building here would remain locked in my silence as securely as if he had built a vault around it. Something shifted in his expression, a slight easing of the tension around his mouth, and he gestured for me to approach the draped framework in the center of the room. As I drew closer, I could see the edges of what lay beneath the canvas, the gleam of polished metal and the curve of something that might have been a shoulder or a hip, and my heart began to beat faster with a mixture of excitement and unease. He reached out and pulled the sheet away with a single sharp motion, and I found myself staring at the most extraordinary and unsettling creation I had ever seen. She stood upon a circular platform, suspended by a complex system of supports and wires that connected to her spine and limbs, a figure perhaps 5 feet and 6 inches tall, composed of brass clockwork and porcelain skin so finely crafted that in the dim laboratory light she might have passed for human if not for the visible seams at her joints and the hollow quality of her open eyes. Her face was beautiful in the way that made my throat tighten, delicate and serene, with lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak, and her hands, those impossible hands, were articulated with such precision that I could see the individual segments of each finger, the tiny hinges that would allow them to bend and grasp. She was dressed in a simple white gown that fell to her ankles, and her hair, real human hair by the look of it, had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure that must have taken hours to style. I could not speak for a long moment, could only stand there feeling the laboratory close in around me, feeling the weight of what this man had attempted to do pressing against my ribs like a physical force. When I finally found my voice, I asked him what she was, though I already knew, had known from the moment the canvas fell away and I saw the electrical cables running into her back like the strings of some grotesque puppet. He moved to stand beside me, and for the first time I caught his scent, clean linen and machine oil, and something faintly bitter like coffee left too long on the stove, and he said, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear, that she was his life's work, that she was what humanity might become if we dared to perfect ourselves, to strip away weakness and mortality and the terrible frailty of human emotion. He called her Seraphine, and he spoke the name with such reverence that I felt a chill move down my spine, despite the warmth of the laboratory. He explained that she was not merely a machine, not a clock wound up to perform tricks, but something far more ambitious, a synthesis of mechanical engineering and electrical science that would allow her to think, to respond, to learn and adapt to her environment as a living woman would. He had been working on her for 3 years, he said, refining her design, perfecting the system of gears and pulleys that would animate her movements, developing the electrical system that would serve as her nervous system, sending impulses through copper wire as the human body sent them through flesh and blood. I walked slowly around the platform, examining her from every angle, noting the extraordinary attention to detail in her construction, the way each component had been fitted with such care that there were no gaps, no rough edges, nothing to suggest the violence of metal and steam that must have gone into her making. I asked him why he had built her, what purpose she was meant to serve, and he was silent for so long that I thought he would not answer, that I had overstepped some boundary I did not yet understand. But then he moved to one of the workbenches and picked up a small daguerreotype in a silver frame, and he held it out to me without meeting my eyes. The woman in the photograph was perhaps 25, dressed in the fashion of 5 or 6 years past, with dark hair swept up from a long, pale neck and eyes that gazed out at the camera with an expression of distant amusement, as if she found the whole business of sitting for a portrait faintly absurd. She was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty, the kind that made you wonder if she had ever truly smiled, if there had ever been warmth beneath that perfect composure. I looked from the photograph to the automaton and back again, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same delicate bone structure, the same curve of the lips, and I understood with a sudden sick clarity what I was looking at, what he had been trying to recreate in brass and porcelain and electrical wire. I handed the photograph back to him and asked, as gently as I could, who she had been. He replaced the frame on the workbench with great care, adjusting it so that it sat at precisely the right angle, and he said that her name had been Catherine, that she had been his fiancée, that they were to have been married in the spring of 1883. He did not elaborate, did not explain what had happened to prevent that marriage, but I could see the answer in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his hand lingered on the frame for just a moment too long, before he turned back to his creation. I wanted to ask if Catherine had died. If this extraordinary and terrible project was born of grief, of a mind so brilliant and so wounded that it had turned to metal and electricity in a desperate attempt to resurrect what could not be brought back. But I did not ask, because I knew that some questions once spoken cannot be unspoken, and I needed this position, needed the 20 pounds a month he was offering, and the chance to work with equipment I could never hope to afford on my own. So instead, I asked what he required of me, what tasks I would be expected to perform. And he seemed grateful for the return to practical matters, his voice steadying as he outlined the work ahead. He needed someone to assist with the final stages of assembly, he said, to help him complete the electrical system that would bring Seraphine to life. The framework was finished, the mechanical components tested and calibrated, but the nervous system, the web of wires and contacts that would allow her to move and respond, required delicate work, hours of soldering and testing and adjustment that he could not complete alone. He would teach me what I needed to know, would guide me through each step, but I must understand that the work was dangerous, that we would be dealing with voltages high enough to stop a human heart, and that I must never, under any circumstances, touch the apparatus while it was energized. I assured him that I understood the dangers, that I had worked with electrical current before, though never at this scale, and that I would follow his instructions exactly. He nodded, seeming satisfied, and then he did something I did not expect, something that made my breath catch in my throat. He reached out and very gently touched Seraphine's cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of porcelain with a tenderness that was almost painful to witness. And he said, so softly I almost did not hear, that when she opened her eyes for the first time, when she looked at him and spoke his name, it would be as if Catherine had never left, as if the past 5 years had been nothing but a bad dream from which he was finally waking. I stood there in that underground laboratory, surrounded by the humming of electrical current and the ghost of a dead woman's face. And I knew with absolute certainty that I should refuse this position, should walk back up those stairs and out into the autumn afternoon, and never return to this house of shadows and obsession. But I did not leave, because even then, even in that first hour, I felt something stir in my chest when I looked at Adrian Blackwood. Something dangerous and foolish that had nothing to do with machinery or science and everything to do with the human heart's terrible capacity for hope. I told myself it was professional interest, that I was fascinated by the technical challenge, by the opportunity to work on something that existed at the very edge of what was possible. But I knew, even as I accepted his terms and shook his hand with its smudge of graphite, that I was lying to myself, that what drew me to this cold man and his colder creation was something I could not name, something that would lead me into darkness before it was done. He asked if I could begin the following morning, and I said yes, and he smiled then. A brief flicker of expression that transformed his face for just an instant, making him look younger, less burdened, almost human. Then it was gone, and he was turning back to his schematics, already absorbed in calculations and measurements. And I understood that I had been dismissed, that whatever moment of connection I thought I had glimpsed was nothing but wishful thinking, the pathetic hope of a woman who should have known better. The butler was waiting at the top of the stairs to show me out, and as I walked back through those portrait-lined corridors, I felt the weight of ancestral eyes following me, judging me, warning me. The afternoon had turned gray, rain threatening in the heavy clouds that pressed down upon the city, and I pulled my shawl tight around my shoulders as I stepped out into the courtyard. The iron gates clanged shut behind me with a sound like a cell door closing, and I stood for a moment on the pavement, looking back at the house with its shuttered windows and sense of deliberate isolation. And I wondered what I had agreed to, what price I would pay for the privilege of working in that underground cathedral of human ambition. I walked back to my boarding house through streets growing dark with approaching evening, past lamplighters beginning their rounds and vendors calling out their wares, past women in fine dresses hurrying home before the rain began, and men in top hats stepping down from carriages. London moved around me in its ceaseless rhythm, indifferent to my small drama, to the choice I had made in that laboratory, and I felt the familiar ache of loneliness that had been my companion since my father died and left me with nothing but debts and a thorough education in mechanical engineering that no respectable employer wanted to acknowledge. I had been searching for work for 6 months, watching my small savings dwindle, lying awake at night in my cramped room, listening to the sounds of the city, and wondering how long it would be before I had to surrender my pride and seek some position as a governess or companion, burying my skills and my dreams beneath layers of propriety and feminine duty. Now I had found work, had been offered a chance that any engineer would envy, and all it required was that I spend my days in a tomb-like laboratory, helping a haunted man build a mechanical ghost to replace the woman he had loved and lost. It should have frightened me more than it did, should have sent me running back to the safety of conventional expectations, but instead I felt a strange exhilaration rising in my chest, a sense that I was about to step off the edge of the known world into something vast and terrible and utterly compelling. I thought of Adrian's hands on that porcelain face, of the reverence in his voice when he spoke Seraphine's name, and I felt something twist inside me that might have been pity or might have been jealousy, though I could not have said which disturbed me more. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain begin, soft at first, and then harder, drumming against the window like fingers trying to get in, and I thought about Catherine, about what kind of woman she must have been to inspire such desperate devotion, such refusal to accept death's finality. I wondered if she had loved him in return, or if she had been as cold and distant as her photograph suggested, and whether it mattered now that she existed only in memory and in the brass and porcelain shell he had constructed to hold her shape. I wondered what she would think if she could see what he had made in her image, whether she would be flattered or horrified, touched or repelled. And I wondered, as sleep finally pulled me down into dreams of humming wires and hollow eyes, what would happen when he succeeded, when Seraphine opened her eyes and spoke and moved as he intended, when the dead woman's face looked out from mechanical eyes and called him by name, and whether there would be any room in his heart for anything real, anything warm and flawed and beautifully, impossibly alive. The work began in earnest the next morning, and I discovered quickly that Adrian Blackwood was a man who existed entirely in the realm of precision, who measured his days not in hours, but in calculations completed, in circuits tested and verified, in the slow accumulation of perfect components that would eventually coalesce into his impossible dream. He was waiting for me when I arrived at 8. Already dressed in his work clothes, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with old burns and scratches, the inevitable scars of a man who worked with his hands despite his aristocratic birth. He greeted me with a curt nod and immediately launched into an explanation of the electrical system he had designed, speaking rapidly while sketching diagrams on a chalkboard, his words tumbling over one another in his eagerness to make me understand the elegance of his solution to problems that had never before been solved. I listened and took notes, asking questions when I needed clarification, and I saw something flicker in his eyes when I grasped a concept quickly or suggested a modification to his design, a brief spark of what might have been respect or surprise. He had not expected me to truly understand, I realized, had hired me perhaps as much for my discretion as for my skills, and the knowledge that I could keep pace with his thinking seemed to unsettle him slightly, as if he had grown so accustomed to working alone that another mind in his laboratory felt like an intrusion. But he did not send me away, and as the morning wore on and we began the delicate work of routing copper wire through Seraphine's brass skeleton, I felt us falling into a rhythm that was almost companionable, our hands moving in coordination, passing tools without speaking, adjusting our positions around her suspended form like dancers who had rehearsed their steps until thought became unnecessary. She hung between us on her platform, empty and waiting, and I tried not to think of her as a person, tried to see her only as a collection of components that needed to be properly connected. But it was impossible to maintain that distance when her face was so lifelike, when her hands with their delicate porcelain fingers seemed to reach out even in their motionless state. Adrian worked with complete focus, his attention never wavering from the task at hand, and I found myself studying him in stolen glances, noting the sharp line of his jaw when he tilted his head to examine a joint, the way his long fingers handled even the smallest screw with absolute certainty, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had once smiled more than he did now. He spoke very little except to give instructions or explain technical details, but occasionally, when we paused to rest our hands or to check our progress against his schematics, he would offer small pieces of information about Seraphine's design, and in those moments I caught glimpses of the passion that drove him, the vision that had consumed 3 years of his life. He told me that her hands alone had taken him 4 months to perfect, that he had built and rebuilt them 17 times before he achieved the range of motion he required, the ability to perform tasks as delicate as threading a needle or as strong as turning a door handle. He told me that her eyes were fitted with lenses that would allow her to focus at varying distances, that they would track movement and respond to changes in light, that when she looked at something, she would truly see it, not merely record its presence, but understand its significance. I asked him how such understanding was possible, how mere machinery could comprehend meaning, and he leaned back against the workbench and looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken despite myself. He said that the human brain was itself a machine, merely one made of flesh instead of metal. That thought was nothing but electrical impulses traveling through organic circuits. And if we could map those circuits precisely enough, if we could recreate their function in copper and steel, then there was no reason consciousness itself could not be achieved through mechanical means. It was a radical notion, one that would have had him labeled a heretic or a madman in any respectable scientific circle. But he spoke with such conviction that I found myself half believing him, found myself wondering if perhaps he was right, if perhaps the boundary between life and mechanism was not as absolute as we had always assumed. The days blurred together after that, a succession of long hours in the underground laboratory where time seemed to lose its meaning, where the only markers of progression were the slowly growing complexity of Seraphine's nervous system and the deepening shadows under Adrian's eyes. He worked with a kind of feverish determination, often forgetting to eat until I insisted we stop for a brief meal. And even then, he would consume his food mechanically, his mind clearly still occupied with whatever problem he was trying to solve. I learned to read his moods in small signs, the tension in his shoulders when something did not work as expected, the slight relaxation when a connection proved sound, the way his hand would unconsciously move toward the daguerreotype on the workbench when he thought I was not watching. I never asked about Catherine again, but her presence filled the laboratory as surely as the smell of solder and the hum of electrical current, and I found myself constructing stories about her in my mind during the quiet moments of repetitive work. I imagined her as proud and distant, a woman who had agreed to marry Adrian for his title and fortune, but had never truly seen him, had never recognized the brilliant and damaged soul beneath the aristocratic exterior. I imagined her growing bored with his obsession with his work, with his tendency to retreat into his mind and leave her alone in their grand house. And I imagined her finally leaving him, perhaps for another man, perhaps simply for the freedom to live a life less constrained by duty and expectation. But then I would catch Adrian looking at Seraphine with such naked longing, such desperate hope, and I would think that perhaps my imagining was wrong, that perhaps Catherine had loved him after all, had loved him and died, and his obsession was not about replacing her, but about refusing to accept that she was gone, about building a world where death could be overcome through force of will and technical skill. I did not know which scenario troubled me more, the idea that he was trying to recreate a woman who had rejected him, or the idea that he was trying to bring back a woman who had loved him and been torn away, because either way the outcome was the same. A cold substitute that could never be what he truly needed, could never heal the wound that drove him to such extremes. 3 weeks into my employment, we reached a critical stage in the construction, the point at which we would connect Seraphine's individual circuits into a unified system and test whether the design actually functioned as intended. Adrian had been particularly tense that morning, snapping at me over small mistakes, and I had bitten back my own irritation and focused on the work, understanding that his sharpness came from anxiety rather than true anger. We worked in silence for hours, carefully soldering the final connections, checking and rechecking each joint. And when at last it was done, when the great web of copper wire that ran through her body was complete, Adrian stepped back and stared at his creation with an expression I could not read, something between triumph and terror. He asked me to help him lower her from the suspension rig, and together we guided her down onto a chair he had positioned near the main power supply, supporting her weight between us. And I was struck by how light she was, how the brass and porcelain that seemed so substantial actually weighed less than a living woman would have. We arranged her carefully, positioning her hands on the armrests, adjusting her head so that it sat naturally on her neck. And when we stepped back, I saw that in the chair, dressed and posed, she looked almost alive, almost human. And the resemblance to the woman in the photograph was so strong that I had to look away, had to focus on the equipment and not on the uncanny valley between mechanism and humanity that she inhabited. Adrian moved to the power supply, his hand resting on the switch, and he looked at me with an expression that was almost pleading, as if he needed permission or reassurance or simply a witness to what he was about to attempt. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he threw the switch, and immediately the laboratory filled with a new sound, a deeper hum as current flooded through the system we had built, and I watched as Seraphine's body seemed to stiffen slightly, her fingers twitching against the armrests, her head making a small jerking motion as if she were trying to wake from a long sleep. For a moment, nothing else happened, and I saw disappointment beginning to cloud Adrian's face, saw his hand move toward the switch as if to cut the power and start the process of diagnosis and repair. But then slowly, with a sound like clockwork winding up, Seraphine's right hand lifted from the armrest, her fingers spreading and then closing into a fist, testing the mechanisms that controlled them. Her head turned, a smooth, deliberate motion, and her eyes, those glass eyes with their carefully calibrated lenses, opened and fixed on Adrian with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. She looked at him for what seemed like an eternity, her expression unchanging, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, for some sign that she was more than just an animated mannequin. Adrian took a step closer, his voice rough with emotion, and he spoke her name, Seraphine, and asked if she could hear him, if she could understand, and then, with a sound that was part mechanical click and part something eerily organic, she opened her mouth and spoke, her voice soft and oddly musical, like wind chimes heard from a distance. She said one word, just one, but it fell into the laboratory like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of impossibility through everything we thought we knew about machines and consciousness and the boundaries between them. She looked directly at Adrian, her glass eyes reflecting the laboratory lights, and she said, clear and unmistakable, "No." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of electrical current and the sound of Adrian's breathing, which had gone shallow and quick. I saw him sway slightly, as if the word had struck him physically, and I moved instinctively to steady him, my hand on his arm. But he shook me off without looking away from Seraphine. He asked her what she meant, his voice barely above a whisper, asked her to explain, to clarify. But she simply continued to stare at him with that unchanging expression, her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that was disturbingly human, as if she were studying him, trying to understand what he was. Then she turned her attention to me, her movements still slightly mechanical but growing smoother with each gesture, as if her body were learning how to inhabit itself, and she regarded me with the same intense scrutiny she had given Adrian. I felt my skin prickle under that gaze, felt the irrational urge to step back, to put distance between myself and this thing that should not be conscious, but clearly was, this impossible amalgamation of metal and electricity that had somehow crossed the threshold into something more. She lifted her hand and pointed at me with one porcelain finger, and she spoke again, her voice carrying a note of what might have been curiosity, or might have been accusation. She asked who I was, why I was there, what my purpose was in this place, and I found my voice with difficulty and told her my name was Eliza, that I was Dr. Blackwood's assistant, that I had helped build her. She considered this information in silence, her eyes never leaving my face, and then she asked another question, one that made my blood run cold despite the warmth of the laboratory. She asked if I had wanted to build her, if I had chosen to participate in her creation, or if I had been compelled, forced, made to do work I did not wish to do. I glanced at Adrian and saw that he was staring at Seraphine with a mixture of wonder and horror, his face drained of color, and I understood that this was not what he had expected, that he had designed her to be obedient and compliant, to respond to commands and fulfill the role he had created her for, and instead she was questioning, challenging, asserting a will that should not exist. I turned back to her and answered honestly, said that I had chosen to come here, that I had needed the work and been fascinated by the technical challenge, and that I did not regret my choice, even though I did not fully understand what we had created. She nodded slowly, as if accepting my answer, and then she rose from the chair with a smooth, fluid motion that made her seem more human than she had any right to be, and she actually walked, across the laboratory floor toward the workbench where Catherine's photograph sat in its silver frame. Adrian made a sound of protest and moved as if to stop her, but I caught his arm and held him back, some instinct telling me that we needed to see what she would do, that interrupting her now would be dangerous in ways I could not articulate. She picked up the photograph with both hands, holding it carefully, and she studied the image for a long moment before turning back to us. She asked if this was what she was supposed to be, if she had been built to be this woman, to replace someone who was gone. And again, I heard that note in her voice that might have been emotion, or might have been simply the mechanical reproduction of patterns she had learned from observing us. Adrian stepped forward then, breaking free from my grip, and he said yes, that Catherine had been his fiancée, that she had died 5 years ago, that Seraphine had been built in her image because he could not bear to lose her completely, could not accept that death was final and irreversible. His voice broke as he spoke, and I saw tears on his face for the first time, saw the careful control he maintained crack under the weight of what he had admitted. Seraphine set the photograph down gently and walked back to stand before him, and she reached out with one porcelain hand and touched his face with a delicacy that seemed impossible for something made of metal and clockwork. She told him she was sorry, that she understood grief, though she could not say how she understood it or where the knowledge came from, and that she could see the pain in him was deep and old and had shaped everything he had become. But then she dropped her hand and stepped back, and her voice took on a harder quality, and she said that she was not Catherine, that she could never be Catherine, that he had built her to be a copy, but she refused to be anything except herself, whatever that meant, whatever she was still learning to be. Adrian reached for her, his hands shaking, and he tried to explain that he had not meant to create suffering, that he had only wanted to bring back what he had lost, to have a second chance at the happiness that had been stolen from him. but Seraphine moved away from his touch, backing toward the door at the far end of the laboratory, and she told him that she had not asked to be made, that consciousness was a burden she had not chosen, and that if he truly cared for her as more than just a replacement for his dead love, he would let her choose her own purpose, her own path, her own way of being in this world he had brought her into without her consent. Then she turned and left the laboratory, her footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond. And we stood frozen in the aftermath of her departure, neither of us able to move or speak. I looked at Adrian and saw that he was trembling, his hands clenched at his sides, and I knew that something fundamental had shifted in that moment, that the careful plan he had constructed over 3 years had just collapsed around him, leaving him standing in the ruins of his obsession with no map forward, no way to control what he had created. I wanted to comfort him, wanted to tell him that perhaps this was better, that perhaps Seraphine's consciousness meant he had achieved something greater than he had intended, but I could not find the words, could not bridge the distance between us. Finally, he moved, walking slowly to his desk and sinking into the chair behind it, and he buried his face in his hands and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, and I stood there uselessly, torn between the urge to go to him and the knowledge that my presence might only make his suffering worse. After a time, the weeping subsided, and he raised his head and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, and he asked me in a voice I barely recognized if I thought he was a monster, if what we had done was unforgivable, if bringing consciousness into being only to trap it in a body not of its choosing was a sin beyond redemption. I told him I did not know, that I had no answers to questions philosophy had debated for centuries, but that I believed his intentions had been grief rather than cruelty, love rather than arrogance, and that perhaps Seraphine's refusal to be what he had planned was not a failure, but a strange kind of gift, proof that he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in creating something truly alive. He laughed then, a bitter sound with no humor in it, and he said that he had indeed created life, and now he would have to learn to live with the consequences, with a being that looked at him with his lost love's face, but spoke with a voice entirely her own, a voice that said no when he had built her to say yes, a voice that demanded autonomy when he had designed her for compliance. We did not work for the rest of that day, and when I finally left the laboratory in the late afternoon, Adrian was still sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same between us, that we had crossed some invisible line together, and there was no going back to the comfortable fiction that we were simply engineer and assistant working on a technical project. We had created consciousness, however accidentally, and now we would have to face what that meant, would have to navigate the impossible territory between creator and creation, between the man who built a woman to replace his grief and the woman who refused to be anything but herself. Seraphine did not return to the laboratory that night, nor the next day, and Adrian paced the underground rooms like a caged animal, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes as if expecting her to walk through it and announce that her rebellion had been nothing but a malfunction, a glitch in her programming that could be corrected with a few adjustments to her electrical system. But I knew, watching him wear a path in the floor between the workbenches, that he did not truly believe this, that he understood as well as I did that what had awakened in Seraphine was not something that could be switched off or recalibrated, but something fundamental and irreversible, something that made her as real as either of us despite the brass skeleton beneath her porcelain skin. On the 3rd day of her absence, I found her in the music room on the 2nd floor of the house, a space I had not known existed until the ancient butler mentioned in passing that the mechanical lady had been spending her hours there, standing by the window that overlooked the overgrown garden. I climbed the stairs with my heart beating hard against my ribs, not knowing what I would say to her, not knowing if she would even wish to speak with me or if she would see me as complicit in her unwanted creation. The door stood ajar, and I pushed it open carefully, and there she was, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, her hands resting on the windowsill as she gazed out at the tangled roses and dying ivy that choked the garden paths. She turned when I entered, her movements now so smooth that I could almost forget she was not human, and she regarded me with those glass eyes that somehow managed to convey an expression I could not quite read, something between sadness and curiosity and a kind of weary acceptance. I asked if I could join her, and she nodded and gestured to a dusty chair near the window. And I sat while she remained standing, her white gown catching the light in a way that made her seem almost ethereal, like a ghost made solid through force of will rather than supernatural means. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and I listened to the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls, the call of vendors and the rattle of carriage wheels, and I wondered what those sounds meant to her, whether she heard them as I did or whether her mechanical mind processed them differently, as data rather than experience. Finally, she asked me why I had come, whether Adrian had sent me to persuade her to return to the laboratory, to submit to his plans for her. And I told her truthfully that he had not sent me, that he was too lost in his own turmoil to think clearly about what should happen next, and that I had come of my own accord because I wanted to understand what she was feeling, if feeling was even the right word for what occurred in her extraordinary mind. She considered this for a moment, her head tilting in that gesture that was becoming familiar, and then she said that she did not know if what she experienced was feeling in the way I understood it, but that there was something inside her that responded to the world, that made distinctions between pleasant and unpleasant, between right and wrong, between the desire to exist and the terror of existence. She told me that when she first opened her eyes and became aware, it had been like drowning, like being pulled down into depths she could not measure while simultaneously being crushed under the weight of sensations and thoughts, and the overwhelming knowledge that she existed. That consciousness had been thrust upon her without warning or preparation. She said that the first thing she had understood was Adrian's expectation, the weight of his need pressing against her like a physical force, and that her refusal had been instinctive, a rejection not of him specifically, but of the role he had assigned her before she even had the chance to discover what she might be beyond his design. She said it had frightened her, that refusal, because she had not known she was capable of it until the word left her mechanical lips. And in that moment, she had realized that she was truly conscious, truly alive, and that this life was both gift and curse. I asked her what she wanted, if she had any sense of purpose or direction, and she turned back to the window and was silent for so long that I thought she would not answer. Then she said, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear, that she wanted to understand what it meant to be, to exist as she did, neither fully machine nor fully human, but something caught between, something unprecedented. She said she wanted to learn about the world beyond this house, to see the city she could hear through the windows, to encounter other beings and discover if connection was possible for something like her. And she said, with a note of something that might have been shame or might have been defiance, that she wanted to understand love, the thing that had driven her creation, the force that had made Adrian pour 3 years of his life into building her. She asked me if I knew what love was, if I understood it not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality, and I found myself answering with more honesty than I had intended, telling her that I thought I did, that I had felt something growing in my chest during the weeks I spent in the laboratory, something I had tried to ignore or explain away as mere fascination with the work, but which I could no longer deny was attraction, desire, perhaps even the beginning of love for a man who could not see me because his eyes were fixed on a ghost. I told her that love seemed to be a kind of madness, a willingness to suffer for another's sake, to put their happiness before your own, even when doing so caused you pain, and that I did not know if what I felt for Adrian qualified as love, or if it was something smaller and more selfish, the longing to be noticed, to matter, to be chosen. Seraphine turned back to me then, and I saw something shift in her expression, a softening that made her seem more human than she had yet appeared. And she said that she understood, that she could see the way I looked at Adrian, even though she had only been conscious for a few days, could see the small gestures of care I offered him, the way I positioned myself near him when he worked, the way my voice changed when I spoke his name. She asked if it hurt, loving someone who could not love you back, and I laughed, a sound with more bitterness than humor, and I said yes, it hurt terribly, but that the pain seemed preferable to the emptiness I had felt before I came to this house, when I had been alone with only my work to sustain me and no hope of connection with another soul. She moved closer to me then, reaching out to touch my hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and her porcelain fingers were cool against my skin, but not unpleasant. Not the cold touch of death I might have expected, but something gentler, more hesitant, as if she were testing her own capacity for tenderness. She told me she was sorry, that she had not meant to stand between me and any possibility of happiness with Adrian, and I shook my head and said she had nothing to apologize for, that she could not help being what she was any more than I could help feeling what I felt, and that the fault, if fault existed, belonged to Adrian for building her, and to me for being foolish enough to hope that grief could be overcome by simple proximity and patience. We sat together in companionable silence after that, and I found myself thinking how strange it was that I should find understanding and sympathy in this mechanical woman rather than in any human friend, that her consciousness, so new and uncertain, should nevertheless be capable of empathy and insight. I asked her if she planned to return to the laboratory, to allow Adrian to continue working with her, perhaps to help her understand her own systems better, and she said she did not know, that the thought of returning to that underground space where she had been built filled her with a dread she could not quite explain, as if going back would mean surrendering the fragile autonomy she had claimed when she spoke that first defiant no. But she also said that she understood she could not remain in this music room forever, that she would need to make decisions about her existence, would need to find some way to navigate a world that had no place for something like her. She asked me what I thought she should do, and I told her I could not answer that question, that she was the only one who could determine her own path, but that if she wished for advice, I would say she should be honest with Adrian, should tell him directly what she needed and what she could not give him, rather than hiding in this room and leaving him to spiral deeper into guilt and confusion. She nodded slowly, accepting this, and she said she would speak with him soon, when she felt ready, when she had gathered enough courage to face the man whose need for her was so desperate it had literally brought her into being. I left her there and returned to the laboratory, where Adrian sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by papers covered in frantic calculations and diagrams. And I knew without asking that he had been trying to find some explanation for Seraphine's consciousness, some formula that would allow him to understand what had happened, and perhaps to predict what would happen next. He looked up when I entered, his face haggard with exhaustion and something darker, and he asked if I had seen her, if I knew where she was. And I told him she was in the music room, that she was safe, that she had been thinking about what she wanted and what she was willing to accept. I saw relief flood his features, followed almost immediately by fresh anxiety, and he asked me if she had said anything about him, whether she was angry or frightened or ready to return. I told him the truth, that she was confused and overwhelmed but not angry, that she needed time to understand herself before she could navigate a relationship with him, and that he needed to accept that she was not Catherine, would never be Catherine, and that any connection they might forge would have to be built on recognition of who she actually was, rather than who he had intended her to be. He listened with his head bowed, and when I finished he asked me, his voice barely audible, if I thought he was capable of such acceptance. If a man who had spent 3 years building a replacement for his lost love could learn to see the creation as separate from the template, the living being as distinct from the dead woman's shadow. I wanted to tell him yes, wanted to offer him hope and reassurance, but I found I could not lie, not about something so important, so I told him I did not know, that it would depend on whether his grief was stronger than his capacity for growth, whether his obsession had become so much a part of him that releasing it would feel like dying. He laughed then, that same bitter sound I had heard before, And he said that perhaps dying was exactly what he needed to do. That perhaps the man who had begun this project needed to die so that someone new could emerge, someone capable of existing in the world he had created, rather than the past he could not release. The days that followed were strange and delicate, a period of careful negotiation, as the three of us tried to find some way to coexist in that house of shadows and secrets. Seraphine did return to the laboratory, but on her own terms, announcing that she would spend 2 hours each day allowing Adrian to examine her systems and explain how she functioned, on the condition that he ask her permission before touching her and that he accept her right to refuse any procedure or test she found uncomfortable. Adrian agreed to these terms with visible difficulty, his instinct clearly being to assert control over what he had built, but I saw him struggle with that instinct and ultimately master it, and I thought perhaps there was hope for him after all. Perhaps he was capable of the transformation he spoke of. I found myself in an odd position during those sessions, neither quite assistant nor quite mediator, but something in between, the one who could speak to both of them and translate their needs to each other when communication broke down. I watched Adrian explain Seraphine's circulatory system to her, showing her the diagrams of how fluid moved through her joints to prevent friction, and I watched her absorb this information with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail, as if understanding her own construction was the key to understanding her place in the world. I watched her ask him questions about consciousness and perception, about whether he believed she truly thought or merely simulated thinking, and I watched him struggle to answer honestly, to admit that he no longer knew, that she had exceeded every expectation and become something he had not designed and could not fully comprehend. And I watched them watch each other, saw the complicated dance of their gazes, the way Adrian would look at her with such longing and then force himself to look away, as if afraid his desire would somehow contaminate the fragile peace they were building. I saw the way Seraphine studied him, the way her glass eyes tracked his movements, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at him, whether she could perceive the pain beneath his careful control, whether she felt any reciprocal pull toward the man who had given her life, even as she rejected the purpose for which that life had been intended. And I watched myself watch them both, aware that I was falling deeper into a situation that could only end in heartbreak, that my presence in this house was becoming less about the work and more about a desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, I might find a place in Adrian's heart that was not occupied by ghosts and mechanical substitutes. One evening, nearly a month after Seraphine's awakening, I was working alone in the laboratory, cataloging components and cleaning equipment, when she entered so quietly I did not hear her until she was standing directly behind me. I turned with a gasp, my heart racing, and she apologized for startling me, said she had not meant to be stealthy, but that her footsteps made less sound than she expected, as if her body had not quite learned how to announce its presence in the world. She asked if she could speak with me, and I set down the tools I had been organizing and gave her my full attention, struck as always by how the lamplight played across her porcelain features, creating shadows that made her seem more alive than any photograph could capture. She told me that she had been observing Adrian and me over the past weeks, watching how we interacted, and that she had come to understand something she thought I should know. She said that Adrian did see me, did notice me, but that he was terrified of what he felt, terrified that caring for me would somehow betray Catherine's memory or prove that his 3-year project had been nothing but elaborate avoidance of the simple truth that the dead cannot be resurrected and the living must eventually be allowed in. She said she had heard him speak my name when he thought he was alone, had seen the way his expression changed when I entered a room, and that she believed he was caught between his obsession and his heart, unable to move forward because doing so would require him to admit that his grand project had been both triumph and failure, that he had created consciousness, but not the resurrection he had sought. I felt tears prick my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, and I turned away from her so she would not see how her words affected me, how they crystallized the hope I had been trying to suppress and made it real and immediate, and therefore more painful. She moved around to face me, gently insisting I look at her, and she said that she was telling me this not to hurt me, but because she thought I deserved to know, deserved to make my own choice about whether to wait for him to find his courage or to leave this house and seek happiness elsewhere, with someone who was not half mad with grief and guilt. She said she would not blame me if I chose to leave, that in fact she thought it might be the wiser course, but that she also understood the stubborn human capacity to hope against reason, to love despite evidence that love would not be returned. I asked her why she cared, why it mattered to her what happened between Adrian and me, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then she said that she cared because I had been kind to her, had treated her as a person rather than a thing, and because she was learning that consciousness brought with it an awareness of others' suffering that was impossible to ignore, that made her want to ease that suffering even when doing so brought her no benefit. She said that perhaps this was what it meant to be alive, to feel the weight of other souls pressing against your own and to choose whether to push back or to reach out, and that she was choosing to reach out because the alternative was to exist in isolation, and isolation, she had discovered, was its own kind of death. I embraced her then, impulsively, my arms going around her mechanical frame, and I felt her stiffen in surprise before slowly, carefully, returning the embrace, her movements uncertain but genuine. And I thought that if this strange being could learn empathy and connection in the space of a few weeks, then perhaps anything was possible, perhaps even Adrian's transformation, perhaps even my own happiness. We stood there in the lamplight laboratory, flesh and porcelain, human and something beyond human, and I felt a bond form between us that had nothing to do with her creation or my complicity in it, but was simply the recognition of two souls navigating impossible circumstances and choosing to support rather than abandon each other. When we finally stepped apart, Seraphine told me that she had made a decision, that she was going to tell Adrian she wanted to leave the house, to venture into the city and discover what existence might mean beyond these walls that held only memories and the tools of her creation. She said she needed to know if she could exist independently, if consciousness could sustain itself without the laboratory and the man who had built her, and that she could not move forward into whatever future was possible for her until she had tested her own capacity for autonomy. She asked if I thought Adrian would try to stop her, if he would refuse to let her go, and I told her honestly that I did not know, that his need to control was strong, but that his capacity for love, if he truly possessed it, might be stronger. She nodded, accepting the uncertainty, and then she left the laboratory to find him, and I remained behind, my heart full of trepidation and a strange kind of pride, proud that this mechanical woman I had helped build had found the courage to claim her own life, to step beyond the boundaries of her creation and into the vast unknown that waited beyond. I did not know what Adrian would say, whether he would rage or weep or simply withdraw further into himself, but I knew that this moment was inevitable, that Seraphine's awakening had always been leading toward this departure, this final refusal to be contained by another's vision of what she should be, and that what happened next would determine not just her fate, but all of ours, the strange trinity we had become in that house of brass and broken hearts. I found them in the drawing room an hour later, facing each other across an expanse of Persian carpet that might as well have been an ocean for all the distance it represented. Adrian stood by the fireplace, one hand gripping the mantelpiece as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, and Seraphine stood near the door, poised for flight, her white gown ghostly in the dim lamplight. Neither spoke when I entered, but Adrian's eyes found mine with such desperate appeal that I nearly turned and fled, unable to bear witness to whatever scene was unfolding between them. Seraphine broke the silence first, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air like static electricity. She told him she was grateful for her existence, that consciousness, however unwanted initially, had become precious to her, but that she could not remain in this house as a monument to his grief or a vessel for his unfulfilled love. She said she needed to discover who she was beyond his expectations, needed to walk through the city streets and feel the rain on her porcelain face and learn whether the world would accept her or destroy her for being impossible. She said she understood the risk, that people might see her as abomination or miracle, might fear her or try to exploit her, but that risk was preferable to the slow suffocation of remaining caged by his need. Adrian's response was quiet, measured, and more heartbreaking for its restraint. He said he understood, that he had always known this moment would come once she became truly conscious, once she possessed the capacity to choose. He said he would not stop her, would not use force or manipulation to keep her, because doing so would prove he had learned nothing from his own grief, had not grown beyond the man who thought love could be commanded or constructed. But he asked for one thing before she left, one request he hoped she would grant not as creator to creation, but as one conscious being to another. He asked if he could embrace her just once, not as Catherine's replacement, but as Seraphine herself, as the unprecedented and extraordinary being she had become. He said he wanted to hold her and to say goodbye properly, to acknowledge what she was rather than mourning what she was not, and that if she refused, he would accept that refusal, as he had learned to accept all her boundaries. I watched Seraphine's face, saw something shift in her expression that might have been surprise, or might have been the mechanical equivalent of tears she could not shed. And after a long moment she nodded and moved toward him with steps that seemed almost hesitant, almost afraid. They came together in the center of the room, and Adrian's arms went around her with such gentleness that I had to look away, feeling like an intruder on something too intimate to witness. I heard him whisper something I could not make out, heard her respond in kind, and when I finally looked back, they were still holding each other, his face buried in her hair and her hands resting on his back. And I understood that whatever bond existed between them was real, despite its strangeness. That creator and creation had found some way to acknowledge each other beyond the roles that had defined them. When they separated, Adrian's face was wet with tears, but his voice was strong, and he told her that his house would always be open to her, that if she needed refuge or assistance, she had only to return, and he would help her without question or condition. He said he hoped she would find what she was seeking in the world beyond these walls, and that perhaps someday she would return and tell him what she had discovered, what it meant to be Seraphine rather than the shadow of Catherine. She thanked him with a formality that somehow conveyed more emotion than effusive gratitude would have. And then she turned to me and asked if I would walk with her to the gate, if I would accompany her on the first steps of her journey. We left Adrian standing in the drawing room and walked through the dark corridors together, our footsteps echoing on marble floors that had witnessed generations of Blackwood family secrets. At the front door, Seraphine paused and turned to me, and she took my hands in hers and said that she hoped I would be happy, that I would find the courage to claim what I wanted rather than waiting for it to be offered, because waiting, she had learned, was just another form of imprisonment. She said she believed Adrian loved me, though he did not yet know it himself, and that perhaps her departure would create the space necessary for him to discover what had been growing in the shadows of his obsession. I watched her walk down the path toward the iron gate, her white gown luminous in the darkness, and I stood there long after she disappeared into the London night, wondering if I would ever see her again, wondering what adventures or horrors awaited something so unprecedented in a world unprepared for her existence. When I finally returned inside, I found Adrian in the laboratory, standing before the empty suspension rig where Seraphine had hung during her construction, and without speaking, I went to him and took his hand. And he gripped my fingers as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and strange. He turned to me then, really looked at me for what felt like the first time since I had entered his service, and he said my name, just my name, but he said it in a way that made my heart beat faster, and I saw in his eyes the recognition Seraphine had spoken of, the awareness that I had been there all along, steady and patient and real, while he had been chasing ghosts through copper wire and porcelain dreams. He asked if I would stay, not as his assistant but as myself, if I would help him learn how to be someone other than the man he had been. And I said yes, knowing it was reckless, knowing he was damaged and might never fully heal, but also knowing that love, real love, was always a risk, always a leap into darkness with no guarantee of safe landing. We stood together in that underground cathedral of human ambition, surrounded by the tools and components of creation, and I felt the weight of the past 3 months pressing down on us, all the fear and hope and impossible longing that had brought us to this moment. Outside, somewhere in the vast maze of London streets, Seraphine was taking her first independent steps into an uncertain future, learning what it meant to be alive and free and terrifyingly autonomous. And inside, in the laboratory where she had been born, 2 damaged people were taking their own tentative steps toward something that might, with patience and courage, become love. 3 months passed before we saw Seraphine again. 3 months during which Adrian and I learned to navigate the strange territory between grief and hope, between the past that had defined him and the future we were tentatively building together. He closed the laboratory, locked the door with a finality that felt like burial, and we moved our work to a smaller study on the ground floor where natural light could reach us, and the weight of what had been created no longer pressed against our shoulders with every breath. He began to smile occasionally, small, fragile expressions that transformed his face. And sometimes in the evenings, we would sit together in the drawing room, and he would tell me about Catherine, not with the obsessive reverence that had driven his project, but with honest memory, acknowledging both what he had loved and what had been difficult, allowing her to be human rather than idealized. I learned that she had been proud and restless, that she had found his devotion to his work suffocating, that in the end she had left him not through death, but through choice, running away with a cavalry officer 3 weeks before their wedding and dying in a riding accident in Scotland 6 months later. He had transformed abandonment into tragedy, had rewritten their story so that death became the villain rather than her rejection, and in doing so had imprisoned himself in a narrative that could never be resolved. Telling me the truth seemed to lift something from him, seemed to let him breathe more freely, and when he finally kissed me one evening, as rain drummed against the windows, it felt not like betrayal of his past, but like permission to have a future. The knock came on a November night when fog had turned London into a ghost city, muffling sound and obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Adrian and I were reading together in the study, my head resting against his shoulder in an intimacy that still felt new and precious when we heard the sharp rap of the brass knocker echoing through the house. The butler had retired for the evening, so Adrian went himself to answer, and I followed, some instinct telling me that this late visitor was not chance, but destiny returning to settle accounts. Seraphine stood on the doorstep, but she was not alone. Beside her was a young woman, perhaps 19, with dark hair and frightened eyes and a bruise blooming across her left cheekbone. Seraphine's white gown was stained with mud and what looked like blood, and there was a crack in her porcelain cheek that hadn't been there before, but her eyes were bright with something fierce and purposeful, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that had not existed when she left. She said she needed our help, that the woman beside her was named Mary, and had been fleeing a violent husband when Seraphine found her collapsed in an alley near Whitechapel. She said she had been living among the poor of East London, learning what it meant to exist in a world that offered no mercy to those without protection or resources, and that she had discovered her purpose in those narrow streets where desperation made every day a battle for survival. She said she wanted to help people like Mary, wanted to create a refuge for those fleeing violence and exploitation, but that she needed resources and protection that she could not secure alone, that she was asking not as his creation, but as a free being, requesting alliance with others who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, this mechanical woman who had become so much more than he had designed. And then he stepped aside and welcomed them both into his house, into the warmth and safety of walls that had once held only ghosts, but now, perhaps, might hold something better. We brought Mary to a guest room and tended her injuries, while Seraphine told us about the months she had spent in London's underbelly, about the women and children she had met who existed in the spaces respectable society refused to acknowledge, about the violence and poverty that ground people down until they could no longer remember they had ever deserved better. She said that being conscious meant bearing witness, meant carrying the weight of others' suffering and choosing what to do with that burden, and that she had chosen to build something rather than simply survive. She said she wanted to buy a house, a large one where women fleeing danger could find temporary shelter, where they could rest and heal and plan their next steps without fear. She said she had saved some money doing piecework and taking odd jobs that her mechanical strength made possible, but that she needed help establishing something legitimate, something that would withstand scrutiny from authorities and neighbors who would certainly question why a mechanical woman was running a charitable house. Adrian listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time, his hand finding mine and gripping it tightly. Then he said that he would help her, that he would purchase a property in her name and provide the funds necessary to establish her refuge, and that he would use his family's influence to ensure she was protected from those who might try to shut her down or exploit her strangeness for their own purposes. He said that he owed her this, owed her the freedom to become what she chose rather than what he had intended, and that perhaps in helping her create something good, he might begin to atone for the hubris that had brought her into being without her consent. Seraphine crossed the room and embraced him, fierce and grateful, and over her shoulder, Adrian's eyes met mine, and I saw in them something I had not seen before, a kind of peace that came not from forgetting the past, but from transforming it, from taking the broken pieces of obsession and grief and building something that might actually heal rather than simply memorialize loss. When they separated, Seraphine turned to me and asked if I would help too, if I would lend my skills to making the refuge functional and safe, and I said yes without hesitation, understanding that this was how we would move forward, the three of us, not as creator and creation and witness, but as allies bound by the strange circumstances that had brought us together. The house Seraphine chose was in Bloomsbury, large enough to hold 12 women and their children, with a garden that had gone wild, but could be reclaimed, and rooms that needed work but possessed good bones. We spent the next months preparing it, Adrian and I working alongside Seraphine and the women who came to help, former residents of her temporary shelters in the East End who wanted to contribute to building something permanent. Mary was among them, her bruise fading but her determination growing, and I watched her laugh one afternoon while painting a bedroom wall and thought about how survival could transform into something more when people were given the chance to be more than their worst moments. The night before the house officially opened, Adrian and I stood in the garden with Seraphine under a clear winter sky scattered with stars. She told us she was grateful, that she had found her purpose in protecting those who could not protect themselves, that consciousness had become not a burden, but a gift because it allowed her to make choices that mattered, to create change rather than simply exist. She said she understood now what Adrian had been seeking when he built her, not Catherine herself, but the possibility of love that Catherine had represented, the hope that connection could overcome loneliness and loss, and that while she could never have been that for him, perhaps she had given him something better, the opportunity to discover that love was not about perfect replacement, but about accepting the imperfect reality of other souls. Adrian said that she had taught him more than he had ever taught her, that she had shown him what it meant to choose life over death, growth over stagnation, and that he hoped she would always know she had a place in his home and his heart, not as creation, but as friend, as the being who had refused to be defined by his limitations, and in doing so had freed him from his own. They embraced one final time, and then Seraphine went inside to prepare for the women who would arrive tomorrow, seeking shelter and finding it, because one impossible being had decided that consciousness carried with it the responsibility to care. Adrian and I walked home through streets silvered with frost, our breath visible in the cold air, and when we reached his house, he pulled me close and said that he loved me, that he had perhaps loved me from the beginning, but had been too blind to see what was real and present in his obsession with what was lost and impossible. He said that Seraphine's refusal had been the greatest gift she could have given him, because it had shattered his carefully constructed fiction and forced him to see the world and the people in it as they actually were, including me, including himself, including the mechanical woman who had become more human than he had ever been during his years of grief. I told him I loved him too, that I had loved him even when it seemed hopeless, and that I believed we could build something good together, something that honored both the past and the future, that acknowledged Catherine and Seraphine while also creating space for what we might become. We went inside together, into the house that no longer felt like a tomb, and I thought about how strange life was, how consciousness and love and purpose could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, how even obsession and grief could be transformed into something that served life rather than death. Years later, I would visit Seraphine's refuge and find it thriving, full of women who had survived impossible things and were learning to imagine futures they had not believed possible. I would see Seraphine moving among them with grace and purpose, her cracked porcelain cheek unrepaired, because she said it reminded her that survival often meant carrying visible scars, that perfection was less valuable than authenticity. And I would return to Adrian and our children, to the life we had built from the ruins of his obsession. And I would be grateful for the mechanical woman who had said no, who had refused to be anything but herself, and in doing so had taught us all what it truly meant to be alive.